Welcome. I'm Donna McKelvey, Vice President of Alliance Development and Membership for Research America. Thank you for joining us for our first panel discussion. The title mirrors that of the forum as a whole, Securing a Science-Strong Future. Many of you know our moderator, Dr. Victor Dzau, the President of the National Academy of Medicine and a member of the Research America Board. The panel also includes Valerie Conn, the President of the Science Philanthropy Alliance, and Dr. Kaf Jaraza, Associate Professor at Duke University Medical Center, and Dr. Bill Hite, the Global Head of Johnson & Johnson Global External Innovation, Dr. Susan Huckfield, President Emerita and Professor of Neuroscience at MIT, and Dr. Iris Lowe-Friedrich, the Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at UCB. Now, during the Q&A portion of this discussion, you'll have an opportunity to pose questions using the Q&A feature. So we're excited to get started. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Dzau.
Thank you, Donna. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'm so glad that I have a chance to spend time with my good friends, colleagues, distinguished member of this panel. So let's put it this way. There's never ever been a time since Sputnik or landing a man on the moon when science has been so much in the public eye as it is today with COVID. In the midst of the pandemic, we've seen science at its best. We've seen a lot of good science, innovation, in a very short period of time. COVID hit US about 7 months ago. Since then, we've seen strong science in vaccine, diagnostic, and digital technology, and many others. Let's use vaccine example. We can see how many years of investment in science technology, all those years have enabled us to move so quickly. Scientists have a new record, developing a vaccine candidate in only 69 days after identification of the virus and the sequence. Currently, there's over 200 vaccine candidates being studied in clinical trials, 12 in phase 2, 7 in phase 3. It's only 7 months after genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 was published. Experts are cautiously optimistic that vaccine will be ready by the end of the year. But yet, at this time, science is being mistrusted and is caught up in a false narrative, pitching science against economy, recovery, and business. So we all know that science cannot do it alone. We do need national leadership, global leadership to use science in a strategic and coordinated way. The theme of this national forum is securing a science-strong future. The first session of this program will be framing up some important issues for the next 2 days. We'll be addressing questions such as, what role is science playing in the COVID-19 response? And what roles are different segments within the R&D pipeline playing in COVID-19 response? And what has COVID-19 revealed about scientific enterprise, the entire enterprise, and access and trust in its benefits? This session, the opening session, is focused on scientific enterprise, that is scientists, communities, what we must do to ensure strong science in the future. This is why we have such a distinguished panel to help us think about where we are in science, where we need to go, and what leadership is needed. So with that background, let's start by getting some thoughts from our audience on what it will take to build a science-strong future. So Caitlin, is it Caitlin who will actually help us display the question, or is it Terry? And let's do a poll from all of you and see what you think.
The poll is now live. Okay,
so questions. Which of the following is the most important future of science? Most trust, more trust and knowledge about science, more awareness about how science works, more congressional champions, greater investment, STEM education reform, or others. And I guess you are given one choice, am I right?
Yes. Yep, they can vote and pick your choice and vote, and then we'll display the results.
This is done live. So let's see what you think. Aha, spot on. More trust and knowledge about science ranks number 1. The second tie is greater investment and more awareness. And of course, we need champions. We need STEM education reform. And I guess when we say other, got 0 because we didn't say what other is. But this is a great start. So, this is a perfect segue to let me start the conversation with our distinguished panel. Let's look at one of the basic hypotheses behind this discussion. That COVID has made science, inclusive of research and development, visible to the public in new and significant ways. A survey Research America just fielded affirms that more people are paying attention to science. So my question to the whole panel is, do you think it's valid to assert that science has become more visible and the public actually may be ready to reconnect with science the way that they did when we're in the Sputnik space race? Or can science again be a source of national pride and robust support by federal policymakers? Or will the public emerge with COVID-19 with more or less trusting of science? And how do you confront the fact that scientific findings suggest one day may be superseded by additional research reviews the next day? And since science doesn't make decisions in forms, can we make sure the public doesn't demonize science for the policy that's made by somebody else that rise from it? So let me start with anyone for this panel. And we have, don't you guys all rush to this? Well, without science, let me ask Susan to begin. Susan.
Thanks, Victor. You've outlined the problem really quite amazingly and well. And I mean, I wish I could be more optimistic about the public view of science during what is clearly one of the most intensive science undertakings since the Apollo mission. And, unbeknownst seemingly to most of the public, we're witnessing a truly unprecedented deployment of scientific, medical, and, all kinds of technologies. And I think one of the things that we're suffering from is, the inability to communicate or our lack of communication over the many decades, because the know-how that we're using right now to develop the new vaccines and, the new diagnostics, all the approaches to COVID, this is from know-how that's been built over many, many decades that's now being deployed into this battle against the COVID pandemic. And, as you recognize, we all recognize this should be a time of immense enthusiasm and awe and appreciation for the literally hundreds of billions of dollars and millions of lifetimes that have been devoted to modern biomedicine. But instead of awe, we mostly hear a sowing of doubt, derision and cynicism for science and scientists. We are, witnessing a dispute of facts and a profound erosion of the confidence that we all should have in our biomedical enterprise. I mean, just think about it. Over the last 50 years or so, America's FDA, CDC, NIH, and more federal agencies have delivered medical miracles. I mean, they are miracles that could hardly have been imagined. And at the same time, protecting us with almost perfect accuracy from dangerous or fraudulent medicines. And we've done so through an unwavering commitment to the scientific method and to carefully established safety paradigms. And so, this is a mystery. So rather than celebrating the discoveries and the discoverers, we hear this constant drumbeat of doubt and suspicion. And I think, of course, I talk about growing up under the shadow of Sputnik. It was that national ambition, that national enthusiasm that was communicated to the public with an unwavering commitment to science and technology, to the scientists and the technologists. I don't recall hearing as loudly as we're hearing today, voices of skeptics. And, to my eye, I think the chance that the Apollo mission could have been completed as it was were much lower than the chance that we're going to be able to fight COVID, well. So I think that, we succeeded previously because leadership at absolutely all levels affirmed the basic principles of knowledge advance And without a shared understanding of how we succeeded against all odds to achieve the technical and medical miracles of today, we're not going to be able to advance into a better future tomorrow. And we talk about all kinds of disparities, but one of the things we're seeing is, almost a knowledge gap. There are people who know and trust with reasonable doubt, and then a completely different set of people who don't know and, distrust with unreasonable doubt. And I think the answer is communication, 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 but we have to communicate basically in one voice.
Great. I'll come back to that issue later, but let me take a comment from a few others. Hey, Bill, you're also in industry and you also distinguished oncologists. Let's say we have a vaccine that's really effective by the end of the year. Would that restore the faith and trust in science?
Yeah, no, thank you, Victor. What I was going to say, speaking of trust, I'm not sure that the pharmaceutical industry ranks at the highest in the public's mind. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is that J&J and 8 other companies have taken a public pledge to uphold the integrity of the scientific process, and that we will not submit our data to the FDA and other regulatory bodies until we complete phase 3. Now, to your question, it won't be a flip of the switch if when we have a vaccine, and there will be a vaccine at some point for sure that's safe and effective. When that happens, that will be a very good thing. But there's so much work, so much more work to be done beyond that to really restore the faith in the scientific process and why science is so important. And during this pandemic, when there is this incredible discussion on both sides, as you and Susan have pointed out, science is always pursuing facts, trying to get to truth. And it's a hit and miss process, because as you mentioned, what we think is accurate today may be contradicted. So it's sometimes a messy process that ultimately gets us to an incredible place, as Susan has pointed out, where we've made dramatic breakthroughs.
Thank you, Bill. Valerie, tell us from your perspective.
Well, Victor, science is the answer. For those of you who have already watched Lyda Hill's fabulous 3-minute video on Research America, Lyda is a Dallas-based philanthropist who you can go into the forum and watch her video. But as Lyda says, science is the answer. We've worked with Lyda Hill and other basic science philanthropists like her for the 5 years since the Science Philanthropy Alliance really got off the ground. And I am feeling optimistic from a philanthropic point of view that we have never seen more enthusiasm or people jumping into the lane of funding COVID-19 related biomedical research. So there are also some trust issues around philanthropy and the role of philanthropy. But in my experience and the experience of our organization, the motivations of the philanthropists and their ability to act fast and nimbly during this crisis has been awesome.
Thanks. Kaf, any comments?
Yeah, so first of all, it's fantastic to be here with you all. I couldn't have imagined a scenario in which I'd be doing a panel from my home, like many of you all. And so as I'm reflecting on this question, I think a lot about the ways we've communicated about what science is and what it isn't, and how that's created part of the gap. Science, we talk about it sometimes as truth, but in many ways it's actually the pursuit of truth. And the framing around the pursuit of truth means that it involves scientists, and undoubtedly those scientists, I'm a psychiatrist as well, so those scientists are human beings with all of their complications and all of their flaws and all of their biases. And science is the process that we set up to navigate all of those biases that human beings start off with as we pursue this idea of ultimate truth. And one of the things that I think is particularly important is to articulate science in that way. Because when we talk about science as an enterprise, it starts off with people with different perspectives and experiences with all of their unique biases and framings, and how you take that collection of individuals to get to an outcome that moves us closer and closer and closer to truth. And in this case, truth being new diagnostics, new treatments, new therapies. It's now a space that allows the American populace to come in. So I think we as scientists also need to think about how we reach out to the broader American populace, make sure that we bring them along. I think there's no better scenario or no clearer scenario, for example, with the idea of a vaccine, where the ultimate effectiveness of the vaccine is actually based on how many people are willing to adopt and utilize that vaccine. So again, I really want to frame this, we're talking about science, to go beyond just this idea of it being fact and truth, because if it's fact and truth, then the times when we're wrong really stand out, and it now looks like it's not fact or truth. But if it's a process where we, as fundamentally flawed, biased human beings, with all of our unique experiences and perspectives, move towards that truth, now there's space for the American public.
Iris, your
Yeah,
comment?
I build on Kaf's comments. I think we have an opportunity to really communicate and explain in a better way what scientific data really mean and what is the respective context, right? Scientific data are the response to a question, but it's us who have formulated the question, and there are assumptions and conditions under which the data have been generated. And I think we need to create the transparency about this. As Kaf said, there's no absolute truth. There is context, and there's healthy scientific debate. And I think what we need to ensure is transparency and really articulating potential biases, articulating potential flaws. I think what the pandemic has unleashed in an unprecedented way is the collaboration between scientists, and that's a huge opportunity to demonstrate to the public that we are all following a common agenda, and that this is really for the benefit of patients, for the benefit of those who are at risk of suffering a specific disease, COVID-19 in that context. And having that healthy discourse across the scientific community, putting the human being at the center, gives us an opportunity to engage the public in an unprecedented way. But again, we have to be collaborative and transparent.
I totally agree with everything you guys said. And we want to start this meeting with a real positive. That is, I've never seen science moving so quickly and really making so much impact. Vaccine. I mean, who thought about a vaccine that can be done in less than a year? Even more than a year, that's amazing. And it's all built, as Susan said, on lots of science platforms that's been leading up to this. Digital technology. I mean, you can do surveillance, contact tracing, even social distancing, and of course, a large amount of data and telemedicine. So it's very exciting. But what you're saying is scientists do what they do, but then the public perceives some things differently. Along the way, there are many issues that we have to communicate better. And of course, we have to work with the news media. So that leads me to the second question. We all know that science is self-calibrating. The findings today may change and may shift over time when you get more data and more data. But doesn't the public think that's conflicted? That is, I can't trust what I'm listening to because today you say this and tomorrow you say wear the mask. And so how do we actually message it correctly in science as data comes out? And of course, data may change our conclusions over time. What do we do about that? Kaif, can I ask you that question?
Yeah, I think, we as scientists have had processes for managing and understanding and interpreting data. And if you think back historically, part of what it meant to be a scientist, it meant you had access to the data. And even who has access to the data now and how available it is and the scale and scope of it has totally changed to how we would think about things 30, 40 years ago. I can get online now and find any amount of data around any topic in ways that data couldn't be accessed before. So that's a challenge in the current framing of how science is. The way we as scientists have navigating the past is we figure out truth based on two things. First, based on precedent. In other words, what was the truth that we believed before? And then the second one is peers, right? So the precedent and the peers become the gatekeeper of this truth. And so how do we navigate what it means to have precedent and peers in this type of framework, where now the entire American populace or the world populace has access to that information? And we need to be able to explain our process of peers coming to truth. And what that means is that if 99 scientists tend to think one thing and one person thinks another, we tend to lean towards the 99 scientists, right? So we do not balance it equal. You don't have to find one scientist that thinks one thing to create a counterweight everywhere else. And so we need to figure out how to allow the American populace to have access to some of that scientific framing. Now, there's certainly times when the one scientist may very well have an idea that others haven't, but there's a process to navigate that as well. And it's by that one scientist working through to change the perspective of the peers. But those are our gateways of truth, and we need to figure out how to share that more broadly with the populace.
And yet, we know that people want data as soon as possible. And as you say, we're sharing data. But we now have a lot of pre-publications that are not peer-reviewed. And as you know, Medrex is a good example. Low quality stuff being published, and it's taken as the truth. How do we manage that, Iris?
Yeah, from my perspective, I'm looking at the evolving landscape of data and information like a puzzle, and you have different pieces of the puzzle at different points in time. And how do we ensure that we really see and explain the overall picture that's coming out of the pieces of the puzzle? The other point that's important for me is I think also scientists need to behave scientifically, right? And in the rush of the early days of the pandemic, hundreds of clinical trials have been launched, and only a few of them have been designed in a way that they create evidence that will really advance our knowledge base. So again, the question is, how do scientists provide adequate context and collaboration of what's being done? Because again, there's a lot of information out there now that is not coming from adequate and well-controlled studies, small studies, not randomized, no control, evolving standard of care. This is not helping. This is not helping science. This is not helping the advancement of knowledge. And getting together earlier and design adequate studies that really provide substantial evidence would have been appropriate. So again, scientists need to behave scientifically to be credible.
It's a tough balance, right? Because CARF says people want data, want to be transparent. When you have it, you want to make it available to public. And yet none of these things are validated, peer-reviewed, or filtered. So, and that's one of the challenges. Sue? Susan?
I think we're in a very interesting period, because this idea of everyone having access to material before it's been peer reviewed. So peer review has been, in a sense, our safeguard, perhaps too safe, perhaps biases, of course, people are doing it. But that really has been the safeguard against unsubstantiated ideas, poorly designed trials. I mean, any number of things that can confound the way we think about things. And it's not the case that every person knows how to evaluate primary data. That's a mistake. We have, we're partly doing that. One of the things that worries me is an erosion of confidence in experts and expertise. Now, these pre-publication sites, I find kind of unnerving. And confidence has come in those sites from the physics community that has shared their pre-publication materials for a very long time, and that's worked okay for them. But I think it's very different in biology and medicine, and frankly, in all of the kind of biomedical enterprises. I'm not going to exclude engineering, but the kinds of research that is targeted to something that will be applied that can affect human life. Truth be told, I love physics. I admire my physicist friends, but those discoveries are not going to have an impact on all of our lives anytime in the immediate future, but the biological findings will. So the idea that I might go to my lab, do some experiments, come up with a purported, therapy for some disease, put it on a preprint, site, give that to the world, and allow the court of public opinion to make these decisions. So I think as biomedical scientists and engineers, we have a very difficult issue to face, which is, at what point do we say this work has met the standards of legitimacy, and should be accepted with all of the appropriate caveats because, you know, through a glass darkly. I mean, we see things imprecisely. We're doing the best we can, but we are really kind of playing blind man's bluff. And it's the best we can do. And do we need 99% confidence before we launch the vaccines? Do we need 99% confidence before we let people try their own favorite home-cooked therapy? I really do believe that our scientific standards have protected us and provided us with overall very, very great products. And I worry that we're eroding exactly those processes now. And frankly, I think that we need to take stock of those new ways of communicating.
Victor, Victor, as Valerie had said a moment ago, I think that how important communication and education is. I was asked just over the weekend by a very prominent commentator about the integrity of the process for the vaccine trials. And what was somewhat news to this individual was that the companies actually don't see the data. The data are seen by an independent data monitoring committee. And those people see the data and they make decisions whether we proceed at a certain point or we stop. We could stop because of safety problems, or we could stop hopefully because of early, very robust signs of efficacy. So I think this education of the public about how the scientific process should work when it works well will help build the confidence we're looking for.
I want to come back to that, but Valerie, here's the question. Who do you trust? I mean, what are the voices of scientists and medical community that people trust? I mean, is there a single voice? Do we need one? And what kind of qualities do you need to have something like this?
So it's interesting, the previous question started with, what can we tell the public for them to trust science? And what struck me in the conversation that ensued, particularly around open data, is how messy science is. And that right now, in this particular period of time, science is even messier than ever because it's accelerating. And there is so much scrutiny, and it's under the magnifying glass or the microscope. And so, for philanthropists, who do they trust? They trust people with a long track record. And so we have seen in the basic science funding community that we work with, that they go back to their peers, they go to trusted institutions, they do go to esteemed and established scientists to ask, where can we best invest? And this comes into, again, the messiness we find ourselves in right now, is that there are very lopsided incentives. And so Susan was pointing out how, open science could be difficult for biological sciences in terms of looking at, the patients and being really patient-centric, but it's also really, often there are financial incentives associated with publishing and openness in data. And so that is something that we are seeing on the biomedical side of the world, and we didn't see in the physics and physical sciences side of the world. And so there does need to continue to be leadership. But Victor, at the National Academies, you're seeing leaders who are coming through who are doing expedited studies in a very, very rational and high integrity form. And so we're seeing the emergence of some new processes and systems that I think are going to make it less messy.
Well, I think it takes a huge effort and a concerted effort to succeed here. Because we look at National Academies, look at ourselves as a trusted voice. Mm-hmm. But if you ask the public, they say, who's the National Academies, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And we're not structured that way. And now we're putting a huge amount on our communication, investment, effort into it. And still, if you go to Google, the search, we don't rise to the top. Misinformation is all over the place. But I do think it takes concerted effort. When I look at all of you, MIT, J&J, National Academy, we come together under one roof and speak with one voice. It'll be really, really important. Yeah. But let me turn to,
can I interrupt? Yeah,
sure, of course.
I don't want to gloss past this because I think it's a really, really key point, right? So within our enterprise, we're fundamentally human, and we're a social species, which means we accept information from people we trust, oftentimes without verifying it, right? And that is something that you see across the general population. It's something that you see in scientists as well. We're trained to try and overcome that bias, but it is fundamentally human. And so a lot of times when I think about the importance of public engagement, you can ask yourself, how many of our colleagues spend time talking to people without college degrees? Well, that's a large population of the US. And so a lot of the work that has to be done is building relationships and trust such that what we have to say about science percolates deeper.
You know, Victor, I hate to say it, but to God's point, when the most powerful person in the world is attacking the integrity of science, it's very, very difficult for any of us, the Tony Fauci's of the world, the Victor Dzau's of the world, the Francis Collins of the world, to combat this, because there are large numbers of people who take those criticisms from the top as gospel. And that's a huge and somewhat unique problem of this moment.
Fair enough, but as Valerie said,
I couldn't agree more. And
yes.
So, and you actually were more explicit than my more vague reference to the Moon Project. There was, you know, obviously there were people who doubted, you know, whether that extraordinary ambition could succeed. But the message that the public got, the message I got as a second and third grader, was that we were going to do it, we were going to figure out how to do it, and it was all hands on deck, and you know, everyone could have a part, at least about their enthusiasm and their interest in a national ambition. And
right.
I fear, you know, despite the extraordinary U.S. biomedical enterprise that has so well served our nation and the world, you know, we can't have confidence unless our leaders are unalloyed in their confidence.
And put science to use in a coordinated fashion. Yeah, so this leads to innovation and the vaccine issue. So Iris, as you know, if you look at the whole development R&D for anything, vaccine, the clinical trials are the ones that is taking a long time. And tell us about innovations in this space. There are people who talk about human challenge trials, things like that, right? So are there ways to move the clinical trials faster because of vaccine and therapeutics? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's two aspects, Victor, that I would like to talk about. One is the pandemic has accelerated innovation in ongoing and existing clinical trials, because we have implemented digital means big time and bigger than we had expected at this stage. So telemedicine instead of visits to hospitals, wearables to collect important data, remote monitoring of data, home delivery of medicines, home nursing services within clinical trials, so that intravenous medicines could be applied appropriately. So I think there is a huge boost in terms of digitalization and innovation in the existing clinical trials. And if you think about it, because all of this was orchestrated to keep patients safe and to avoid that they needed to go to the clinics and to also protect clinics from the workload on top of the pandemic. If you think about it, all of this has also moved our clinical trial model towards a more patient-centric model. And we have, together with Transcelerate, really put a toolbox in place that will survive the pandemic and that will set new standards in clinical trial innovation. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the other aspect is that we are running different types of trials. So master protocols or platform trials. So we're all looking currently at the COVID-19 patient population, or we'll look at the to-be vaccinated population, and then trying medicines within one clinical study next to each other versus standard of care. And these types of studies that require collaboration from different sponsors, but that give you rock solid data in large patient samples are the future. And I think one of the topics that we need to drive forward now within the pandemic and in the future is how can we collaborate more? Instead of doing numerous individual trials, can we establish platforms that keep running in specific populations,
Right.
and then add new medicines or new developmental agents into the study, have a solid control, have the data shared appropriately, and have regulators, patient advocacy groups, academia, industry, working on the design of these protocols together. It has started now, it needs to continue, and it will drive the future of how we do clinical development. So big opportunity, and we are working to not miss what we're doing together.
So, but I can't help to come back to Bill, because the gold standard is phase 2 clinical trials, then go through the proper evaluation and approval by FDA, right, Bill? And the declaration that many of you guys made together says that we will complete those trials, we'll have those data analyzed, and won't turn it over to regulatory approval until this is all done. So this leads to the very burning question everybody's worried about, which is emergency authorization, right? And what kind of data, I mean, we're talking about emergency authorization, explain to the public a little bit about that, and would you submit the data when all the trials are done, analyzed, and then subject to decision of emergency authorization or FDA approval, versus that they can have an early look, if you will, before the trial's completed, like a DSMB, to say, oh yeah, we're now going to use emergency EUA to approve this drug?
As a general rule, emergency use authorization for therapeutic agents or vaccines is not such a hot idea. Remember, the problem with a vaccine is once you inject it, you can't take it back. And if you're going to inject, thousands, millions, billions of people, you need to be very, very careful about what you agree to do. However, there is the possibility, and I think it's relatively unlikely, but there is the possibility that an early look at the data, these are pre-specified interim analyses looked at confidentially by the DSMB, the IDMC, that shows extraordinary results in terms of antibody production, T-cell responses. It is possible, although again, it would be unusual, it's possible that companies might go forward with this type of review to the regulators, but it would have to be truly extraordinary. Rather, there are other ways to get around problems that companies face and everyone faces in the development process. For example, when we developed an Ebola vaccine, one of the things we actually anticipated and wound up having to deal with, there was no more Ebola. That disease is so bad, when you get it, you die, and there's no more cases. So the FDA does have something, they don't love to use it, but it's essentially a surrogate endpoint called the animal rule, where if you vaccinate people and then show that the sera from those vaccinated people can protect animals from the disease, that is an acceptable way in the circumstance where there's no other way to do the trial. But the gold standard remains carefully designed, prospective, randomized, blinded trials in phase 3, especially when you're dealing with the possible risks of a vaccine, because as I said, once you inject it, you can't take it back.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Let me talk about the broad issue of the research enterprise. We talked about earlier. It's not only about the scientists, it's also about the public, it's also about trainees. Kav, you thought a lot about this, particularly in these days of social justice issues, many others. How do we make sure we get trust in the public, but also importantly, that we have a pipeline of diverse, excellent scientists from very early all the way through? Is there in fact a systemic racism, for example, in STEM education? Your point?
Yes. Yeah, let me make 2 points. The first one is, I talked a little bit about precedent and what has come before, and I think this has been a real coalescence of both thinking about the virus and the pandemic, as well as systemic racism and them coming together. And I have been encouraged by some changes in precedents that I've seen, particularly around the vaccine development. I think this is one of those unique times where we say we could go as fast as possible, but let's slow down to make sure that the whole American population, particularly those who have been impacted by this disease, individuals who are Black, Hispanic, are involved in the clinical trial process to make sure it applies more broadly. So that's a real important lesson that I think we can take going forward. It's not just always about the scientific expedience, it's actually about making sure that the treatments and therapeutics we develop apply to everybody. On the other side, I'm thinking about the scientific enterprise. I think we've known for a long time that there are certain populations in our country that are underrepresented in the scientific workforce. And I talk a lot about the pursuit of science and the human part, because asking questions and who's asking the questions is a really important factor in the questions that get pursued. And we have been lagging in our ability to generate scientific workforce that looks like our population. I think the outcomes that we see are absolutely connected to the workforce asking the questions. And if we are to bridge the historical precedent where we've done challenge trials in the past, and those challenge trials have been things like exposing or letting certain populations be exposed to diseases and not treating them. If we are to bridge that, it will require scientists that emerge from those communities that have been harmed in the past. And that is something that won't happen accidentally. We're going to have to focus on it as a nation.
It's very, very good. So Valerie, funding is so important. And it's wonderful that your organization have brought together many philanthropists to fund science. But we think about philanthropy as interested in cancer, cardiovascular, Alzheimer's, and takes a long time, long-term, deliberate process to say we fund this. In a time of crisis and health threats, what's happening with the philanthropic funding world?
So we have found in the past that basic science funders it's like going on a long road trip. They get in their lane and they stay in it over a long period of time. During the crisis, we've seen actually some emerging phenomenon amongst science philanthropists. Some traditionally biomedical funders have stayed in their lane but expanded their giving. Others who are the non-biological funders, the physical science funders, have actually changed lanes temporarily to fund COVID-19 related research. And then there's the emergence of a new, sort of a third population of funders who are getting into the lane of funding infectious disease research. And so that is a really big change. As recently as 3 years ago, our team could only identify 3 basic science research funders who were really interested in infectious disease. And that, in a recent survey we just did, I'm happy to say that we have a several orders of magnitude larger group now interested in this. But the other topic that has come up amongst our membership in a meeting as recently with 90 philanthropists 2 weeks ago, we had extensive conversations about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. And how can funders fund the inequity and disruption, distress of the lives, particularly of early career scientists right now? And so the issues that Kof just raised in the clinical setting, funders are also grappling with what's the most effective way to fund and incentivize the research enterprise to be DEI, to focus on the research through a DEI lens.
Got it.
No, Victor, there's another sort of systemic bias that I just realized you and I have discussed it, and it's I call it treatment bias. What's emerged during this epidemic is the importance of prevention. And yet so much of our work and so much of our funding is focused on treatment. But now prevention and diagnostic testing. Diagnostic testing landscape was a desert. And now the pandemic hits and is huge demand on getting accurate, inexpensive diagnostic tests. The last time I checked, testing doesn't cause the disease, but proper use of testing, tracing, and tracking can actually help us tamp down and get rid of this thing. So it's just changed, and it is a bias. And the National Academy, with your Healthy Longevity initiative that we love, is really taking a lead in this.
With your help. But Susan, I know she's got a point of view there. Susan.
Yeah. I do. Well, thanks for mentioning that. Actually, let me just kind of touch on what Valerie said, because one of the things that just has made me feel so proud of our enterprise of funding research is that local philanthropists, and I'm sure this is true around the country, have stepped up to fund so many of these, projects that just were imagined kind of, by a small group of people or a large group of people getting together. So we've seen, at least in the greater Boston region, unprecedented collaborations across institutions, across sectors, and to do projects that are designed to accelerate progress against COVID. And everyone needs to get funded to do these things, and our local philanthropists and beyond have stepped up to make that kind of work possible. So in many ways, this has been, one of the most inspiring times for the pursuit of purpose in this kind of joint, all hands on deck, everyone's being part of it. Diagnostics, as Victor knows and Bill knows, is one of my kind of pet peeves. And I describe the situation in our nation as having a dramatic diagnostics deficit, and it has been demonstrated in just shocking vividness through COVID, and it doesn't need to be this way. And so, Bill's talked about, how critically important diagnostics not in hundreds of thousands, but in hundreds of millions, and the ability to diagnose rapidly, accurately, and in, hundreds of millions of cases, we've got to be able to do that. It's the only way to control a disease, like this. And frankly, I know Singapore set up after SARS-1 a national diagnostics hub to develop their alacrity in diagnostics. And frankly, the countries around the world that have done best with against COVID are those that have diagnostic facility, which we don't even yet have. Well, so that's one piece of it. But the other piece is what you all talk about is our treatment bias. I mean, I have colleagues, myself included, I would say, who have thought about using some discovery in our lab to start up a diagnostic. And the advice always is, don't do diagnostics. They don't pay. You can't get diagnostics. So what happens? We don't have any innovation in the diagnostics realm. Yeah. But if we think about our healthcare problem in the United States, we're spending 18% plus of our GDP on healthcare. And, while we have all the medical miracles that we feel, I think, justifiably proud and kind of relieved to have in place, we could change the game and change the dollars that go into it if we changed our focus to early diagnostics and early intervention and understanding who we need to treat when. It just, to me, it's a crazy idea that you wait because of our diagnostic accuracy and sensitivity. You wait till someone's falling off the cliff with a cancer diagnosis to try and pull them back, and that's really expensive. And frankly, the yield is much less than it could be. If we could diagnose accurately and early, treat disease accurately and early. And so I think that the whole US medical establishment really deserves a rethink in terms of how we approach disease. And, I hadn't heard this word, treatment focus rather than detection focus. So I'm enthusiastic about it. And one of the reasons I'm enthusiastic about it is that the technologies that are now evolving for diagnostics exhibit this marvelous combination of biology with engineering and these kind of, almost science fiction kinds of technologies that, could deliver much better results for all of us. I'll stop. I'm sorry. I can get very excited about this.
You think Susan's enthusiastic about this topic? but Susan, what you say is so true. There are really two interrelated pieces. One, which is investment in diagnostic, particularly during this time. And second is the development diagnostic as a product, if you will, for use. They're interrelated, but I would say on the former, to be fair, Congress has funded over $1 billion for rapid diagnostics. There's a entity run out of NIH called REDX, which is really looking at lots of innovation diagnostics. And globally, the Accelerator is also doing a huge amount of work in this. I think what you're saying also is, even they find their way, in the long run, diagnostic as a whole is not reimbursed properly and is not funded properly. And hence, it's a market failure to some extent. Although there's evidence now, there's a lot of effort in trying to at least do diagnostic during COVID. I want to close the meeting with an upbeat note because we want to open to the audience. Iris, I know you've been working on this COVID R&D Alliance. This is very exciting. Tell us a little bit more about this, because what we've been saying all day is how do we all come together to make things move faster, right? So Iris, can you tell us a little about this?
Yeah, of course, and it's related to what I said earlier. It's about 20 companies working in biopharma coming together and working together on platform trials for treatments of COVID-19, very closely connected with regulatory authorities, FDA, of course, with the National Institutes of Health, with other private-public partnerships involved. So it's a broad effort to ensure that we run the best clinical protocols with the most scientific rigor that will deliver valid evidence in the shortest period of time. And COVID R&D is evaluating more than 1,900 molecules in research to molecules that are already being marketed for their utility in the treatment of COVID-19. So it's a huge and quite unprecedented collaborative effort. And again, I want to stress the point, this is really private-public partnerships in action to drive science and to drive evidence generation that is solid, that can be trusted, and that will yield appropriate benefit risk assessments of the resulting treatment options.
Thank you. You know, I can't help but point out one other issue, which is how we define science. I think Carl did it really nicely. But when people think about COVID, they think about public health, emergency, but in fact, there's so much science behind it. Basic science, curiosity-driven science, social science, and economics, all that in many ways have to come together, and you can't do with one without the other. I know my panelists agree with me, so I won't ask them to comment, except now turn over to Research America to get audience Q&A.
Great, thank you. Yes, we do have a few questions. Hopefully we can get through as many as possible. One topic that is appearing in the chat and the Q&A is about speed of progress. Dr. Keith Yamamoto mentioned in the chat the importance and potential for preprint servers to accelerate progress quickly. And related to that, a question in the chat as well. The Project Warp Speed is advanced so quickly in the midst of the pandemic. It's largely, and maybe even entirely, the result of collaboration among all the stakeholders: international government, industry, academia, patients, etc. So if you do believe we can capture that sauce and apply it to health challenges, for example, diseases, does that constitute a national or international emergency? And I'll let Dr. Dzau send that to whoever.
Bill, you want to take that on?
Yeah, I think it really is a tremendous example how groups have come together. So initially in the US with BARDA, recognizing the pandemic as a global threat, partnered with several companies to begin to move at risk in the development of vaccines. Then similar agencies literally around the world have done similar things with a quid pro quo that companies that are receiving this money have certain responsibilities to access to the vaccine fairly and around the world, that pricing wouldn't be an issue, that these would be affordable. And that confluence of events, people coming together so they could begin to invest at risk, is helping speed up the process in ways that we wouldn't have anticipated before. So for example, we, and I'm sure the other companies as well, we're ready to go with 1.5 billion doses of vaccine next year, even though we don't know if the vaccine is going to be safe and effective. But we could do that because of these partnerships.
Well, I mean, kudos have to go to the government willing to fund the risk manufacturing side of things too.
Absolutely.
And it comes from taxpayers' money. So we're very proud of the fact that we're all helping in one way or the other, directly or indirectly. Now, the real issue is to be able to apply this globally, because there are a lot of poor countries that don't have the deep pocket of the United States. They can't do things like this, and they have to find ways in which they get a share of vaccine. It's a big issue. Let's take another question.
All right. Okay. When we look at science trust, is it really about science, or is it about policies that scientific findings contribute to? Science, by its very nature, often informs policies that are going to be polarizing in society with competing political ideologies. Which ideology is going to be more comfortable with government mandates, for example?
Whoa, that's a tough one. I'm sure everyone can answer. Any one of you want to put up your hand, or should I call on you? Okay, Kaf.
So let me say it this way. I think we need more Benjamins, and when I say that, I mean both in terms of, we certainly appreciate the investments in increasing the NIH budget recently, but I think a lot about future health threats, where the investments are going to be critically important to offset. You know, we are, as a nation, are experiencing a national trauma in COVID, and I think a lot about the neuroscience impacts and the mental health impacts, and the research investments that need to be made now to offset some of those major challenges later. But secondly, I think we need scientists that are willing to cross into the public sphere, right? I think Benjamin Franklin is such a remarkable example of this, of both doing science, but really building relationships across the political spectrum such that science can play a prominent role in the policy that's being shaped. So I think we need scientists to not just be in the lab and engaging in that sphere, but to be willing to devote part of their career to connecting with the political arena as well.
Yeah, and do the science policy. Valerie.
A quick comment there. There's a wonderful confluence, Susan, of an emerging field called civic science that I know Research America and our organization and others are involved with, who are bringing science and advocacy and policy all together into the public sphere. We have a civic science fellow at the Science Philanthropy Alliance. It's a fabulous program, and I think that is going to be part of the future answer to how we deal with trust from the public.
Great. We have time for another question.
I think we're about to wrap up, so I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing remarks.
Sure. No, well, closing, I want every one of my panelists to say something. You know, I think that you guys have been outstanding, brought up really the major issues. I have to say that I'm very encouraged on one hand, given what each one of you have said about collaborations, speed of science, you know, and the integrity of science in the scientific community, and the connection with policy. We are cautious about the issue of misinformation, mistrust, and perhaps the lack of coordination of science to address crisis and others. But let me ask each one of you say one word, one sentence, one phrase. Would each one of you choose one comment or question raised in today's discussion that speaks to the role of science should play in policy funding landscape, or the way the science should be applied inside, outside, in the policy-making arena? Let me start off with you, Kaf.
Yeah, I think we have reached a unique time in which we have this global pandemic and COVID, and we're wrestling with the impacts of systemic racism. And in both cases, if we deny their existence, they spread. We need a national effort and national investments to directly target the problem. Otherwise, our country will be hurt.
Thank you. Iris?
For me, it is about credibly putting human beings, patients at the center of our scientific effort, and in a credible and trustworthy way, advance scientists to the benefit of human beings and patients in a collaborative and transparent way.
Thank you. Valerie?
We have an opportunity to fund scientific capital through funding human capital. And we have the opportunity to, rather than having a lost generation of scientists, to have the science generation right now.
Terrific. Bill?
I'll pick up on the moonshot theme. And Kennedy said something like, we choose to go to the moon and do other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And this process will bring out the best in us. And I'm really hopeful that despite the pain and suffering, morbidity, mortality from the pandemic, that the process will ultimately show that it has brought out the best in us.
Thank you. Susan.
Boy, it's hard to add to what my colleagues have said. And I would just say that if out of all of this, we can call into focus the extraordinary investments that have been going on, frankly, since post-World War II. Vannevar Bush said, if we want to build the technologies of the future, we've got to invest in fundamental research to get there. And we have been doing that since the 1950s. And the advances we're making today draw on those advancements and the people who have devoted their lives. And I just really hope that the successes that I anticipate we're about to see will call out this incredible legacy that's built on, the shoulders of giants and the incredible investments that our nation and other nations have made to provide the, as I call it, the parts list that allow people to find their way to therapies, diagnostics, and the vaccines that will call COVID to a halt.
Well, thank you so much. As I'm listening to all of you, I'm optimistic. And science strong is the theme of this meeting, and I do think science is strong. I'm optimistic that, in fact, science will prevail and vaccines will emerge, and I think we're going to continue to move forward with well-being and health. I do think we've learned a lot that we need to work together. We need to engender trust. We need to communicate. We need to have great funding, of course, investment, and we need to have great attention to STEM education, pipeline, diversity, and all the others. So thank you so much. Can all of you join me in giving a round of applause? I'll try to do it this way. Thank you. I enjoyed it. So
Great.
Over to you, Donna.
Lovely. And let me add my thanks. That was absolutely outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Dzau. And thank you to all of our panelists. Now, remember, you can follow along in the chat feature and, of course, on Twitter using the hashtag RAForum. So now moving on to our next segment here, our 20 Voices, 3 minutes, 1 question segment will feature Sean Breen from Takeda. As you will hear, Sean addresses a strategic approach to R&D that will be critical to securing a science-strong future.